All right, and good afternoon, everybody. Steve Kornacki here at the big board, and now just 8 days away. That's right. It's a Monday. We're going to go through this week, and then at the start of next week, Tuesday of next week is the big day that we have been counting down to from this board for a long time now. The midterm election, the 2018 midterms, they are now just 8 days away. Of course, that's the election day. That's the night we're going to get all the returns coming in through the board right here. Of course, there have been millions of people already out there voting, early voting, absentee voting. It's been going on for a long time. Vote by mail. It's been going on for a long time out there. So the voting in many ways is already underway, but 8 days from now, it all comes to a head. And those critical questions we have been asking, which party is going to control the House? 218. We call this show 218 because we're asking that question. Which party is going to end up with at least 218 seats and with control of the House of Representatives at the end of this election? Democrats, of course, needing a net gain of 23 seats to pull that off. There is also the question of the U.S. Senate. Republicans control it right now. Democrats need a net gain of 2, but the path, when you look at the states, the battleground for the Senate is so difficult for Democrats. But are we in for any kind of a surprise there? Or is the Republican majority actually going to expand on the Senate side? Are we looking at a possible scenario where Democrats take the House as Republicans expand their Senate majority? That doesn't seem impossible either. And there are a collection of marquee governors' races out there. We're going to be talking about those a little bit this week as we continue this countdown. Think of Florida, think of Georgia, think of Wisconsin, think of Kansas, a couple others out there. High-stakes governors' races, big implications for redistricting, big implications for what it says about the mood of those states as 2020 starts to approach. And believe me, as soon as 2018 is over, there'll be plenty of talk about 2020. But the conversation still now squarely on the issue of 2018 and the question of what's going to happen in these midterms. And there's one wild card out there. You know what we do on this show? We focus on one particular facet of the midterms. Each episode, we talk to an expert who helps us dive deep into it. Well, here's one for you. And here's one it sounds like we're talking about before every single election. We talk about young voters. And we say about young voters, are they extra motivated this year? Are they going to turn out in numbers we haven't seen before? Are they going to turn out lopsidedly for one party? Are they going to make a difference in the election? And it seems like 2016, 2014, 2012, we have been talking about this, raising this question for a long time now. So to put this in some perspective, because we've got a guest today who's got some interesting new data on this, but to put this in some perspective, talk about here, just think of the 2016 presidential election. Think about how many people actually turned out and voted in the 2016 election. Well, when you look at the youngest group of voters in 2016, we'll say those who are under 30, so 18 years old to 29 years old, 18 to 29-year-olds, the turnout rate was about 46% for them in 2016 in the presidential election. Now, what if you go to the next group? What if you go to those who were 30 to 44 years old? What was the turnout rate there? Well, it jumps. Now you go from 46% among young folks to about 59% as you get into the 30 to 44-year-olds. What about the next age group? What about those who are 45 to 64 years old? What did you get there? Again, it jumps about 67% turnout in the 2016 election. And then the oldest group, folks who are 65 years plus, what was the turnout rate there? Another increase up to 71%. So you see, look at that. Oldest people, 71% turnout. Youngest people, we could say here, this is 18 to 29, 46%. This according to the census figures on this. So that's always been an issue. In a presidential election even, look, that 18 to 29-year-old turnout was actually up slightly from 2012. But look at that, a giant gap there, a 25-point gap there when you compare that to folks 65 years and older. So there's always an issue there of the youngest voters not being represented at the polls in the same numbers as different age groups because the turnout rate is lower. But that is always a lot more pronounced, not in presidential elections, but in midterm elections, when there's not a presidential race, when there are not presidential candidates out there getting all the attention, it's just races for the House, just races for the Senate. That 18 to 29-year-old number, it tends to fall off a cliff. Everything is down, but that 18 to 29-year-old tends to fall off a cliff. So for Democrats, looking ahead to these midterms in 2018, knowing that they tend to poll pretty well, when you just take a poll of young voters, they tend to poll pretty well, Democrats do. That question has been, can you try try to reverse that trend of that number, which is always low to begin with, becoming extra low in a midterm election. And so that's where the new poll we've got, we're going to talk about here today, comes in, because this is brand new. And check this out. This is from Harvard's Institute of Politics. They do a survey of young voters every 2 years. And check this out. This is the interest level of voters 18 to 29 years old heading into midterm elections, 2018, 2014, 2010. And the folks who are 18 to 29-year-old who say they have a very high likelihood of voting sits at 40% right now. Look, you can compare that. The last midterm election, we say it normally falls off a cliff. It was almost half the number, 23% in 2014. In 2010, 27%. Now sitting there at 40%. So on paper at least, that is a significant difference. That shows a significant increase relative to past elections of young people saying they're interested, they're tuned in, they are likely to vote in this election. Some of the other findings that they have in here, again, we say Democrats sense an opportunity here with young voters because these are the numbers we've sort of been seeing here in Harvard's poll. 66% of these 18 to 29-year-olds, basically a 2-to-1 margin here, to say that they would be supporting Democrats. They want to vote Democratic. They want Democrats to control Congress. Donald Trump, this is, again, no mystery here, no secret here. Donald Trump has not been popular with young Americans. Here's another poll, though, that shows it. Look, an approval rating of 25% for the president with 18 to 29-year-olds. Poisonously low numbers there. How about this? The idea of Donald Trump being reelected in 2020, again, among the same circle of voters. Look at this number at the bottom here, though. This is what really jumps out to me. See if I can find the... is this the thing that circles? Let's see if that... There you go. 63.6% saying that never, under any circumstances, 18 to 29-year-olds, never under any circumstances would they vote to re-elect President Trump. About 2/3 there saying not even unlikely, just not going to happen. So again, Democrats have been seeing numbers like this about Trump. They've been seeing numbers like this about Republicans for a long time, and they've been hoping that that would translate into some sort of bounty for them at the polls in a midterm election. What they're up against, as we're saying, what they're up against is history. But that number, that 40% in this new poll, brand new poll out, suggests maybe, possibly, things are going to be different in this midterm election. So to find out more about what's in these numbers and about whether that's going to translate into something real and something potentially big politically on Election Day. And joining me now is John Della Volpe. He is the director of polling at the Harvard Institute of Politics. He conducted this survey. He joins us now. John, thank you for taking a couple minutes to be with us. This is fascinating what you've got here. So on paper, 2010, 2014, 2018, you have found a big difference in your own polling, something you didn't see in past midterms. Is this automatically going to translate into Election Day?
What's been interesting about our polling is that young people consistently overrepresent their likelihood of voting. For example, the years when they said 27% would show up, 20% showed up. So it's -10. And then 4 years later, similar number, 24%, 23%, 16% showed up. So we've been consistent with a trailing number of about 8.5, 7.5, 8.5 points. So that's been consistent. So even with that, as many, sometimes as 10 points lower, we're still 30.
I mean, that would, right. So if the turnout was 32% as opposed to 16, that's still a big difference.
Exactly. And consistently since 1986, so this is not a millennial problem. This is a problem in terms of youth turnout. Millennials, Gen Xers, and baby boomers. Only 2 times since 1986, Steve, have younger voters showed up at more than 20%. That was at 21% in 1994 and 21% in 1986. So the bar is low, which I think, given this and the attitudinal change we've seen over the last couple of years, indicates that I think they'll break that.
And when you're seeing it, that it might be different with a long, decades-long, sort of storyline here. Is it Trump? Is it as simple as it's Trump and he's energized them?
What we've seen is a beginning of an attitudinal shift. A generational attitudinal shift. The first time we tracked this was in 2000, before and after 9/11. The reason that young people didn't vote in 94, 96, 98, et cetera, is because they didn't think politics mattered. They didn't see a tangible difference between one party and the other party. 9/11, the tragedy, changed that. And we saw, frankly, a 9-point increase of the youth vote for John Kerry from 40 to 49% between 2000 and 2004. That gap dissipated. Politics became less relevant, less tangible after the Obama election, gridlock, et cetera. That shifted again, a similar 15-point shift, 9/11-like attitudinal shift before and after the 2016 campaign. So yes, whether they're Sanders voters who were concerned that Hillary wasn't doing kind of using kind of her best to motivate them, or whether it's Democrats upset with what's happening in Washington with Trump, he's a factor. He's not the only factor, but he's a driving factor.
It's interesting to hear you mention 2004 as well, because I do remember that campaign so well, and Democrats were excited about it. Young voters were going to propel Kerry to the White House. We're going to knock George W. Bush out. And right, there was much more excitement among young voters, but it also turned out there was much more excitement among everybody else. Is there room for that possibly here in this midterm, where we look back and we say, well, wow, there was 18 to 29-year-old surge of excitement, but every other group was up too, and it kind of washed it out?
Well, it's the combination, right, of share, but also the margin. John Kerry won 55% of the vote. So yes, they increased, but for Democrat to win on a national stage, they need to get, he or she needs to get closer to 60%. Obama got 66%, then he got 60%. I do think, the average share in a midterm year is around 10% for the less than 30 vote. Presidential year would be closer to 15%. For every 3 points increase in share is going to translate to about a point in terms of, because of the margin, a point in the generic ballot. So I think, as you said on the board a minute ago, there's a much higher ceiling for young people to increase the levels of participation. So I do think they can kind of catch up and get closer to that 15%, presidential year kind of share.
Some of the issues and some of the ideas that are animating young voters, you have them in the poll here, that really kind of jumped out at me. I'll put this one out to you. It was this question of capitalism and socialism.
Yeah.
Basic attitude here. So do you support capitalism? This was basically an even split almost. 43% said they support it. 46% said no. You ask them about socialism, 30% yes, 59% no. So a little more negative on socialism. I think there was also one where if you threw in democratic in front of socialism, it went up a little bit. But wow, that is just numbers like that we weren't seeing 20, 30 years ago in polls.
No, in fact, so the first time we asked that question was in 2016. And I saw the results, and I thought that was the 5% of polls with a margin of error. That was wrong. That was a bad sample. I took the poll again, because, and we found the exact same number of young people kind of rejecting capitalism, specifically the way in which capitalism was practiced in 2016. And we continue to see that essentially kind of unchanged. What we found was, when we actually shared a definition of capitalism, support went up. When we shared a definition of socialism, support went down. So it's not true, I think, that this is a generation of socialists. This is a generation that is indicating that capitalism for them isn't working the way in which it should be, in terms of the way in which the free market should operate, opportunities for everybody, those sorts of things. So it's as much about a branding issue, I think, as an economic and political system, because as you noted, when you add the word democratic in front of socialism, it's actually more likely voters support that than capitalism.
It's interesting, too, you had a question here about the issues that are most animating, where you get the most support among 18 to 29-year-olds, and one of them, single-payer health care.
Yeah, so that's what we want to do. We want to kind of strip away the labels. And what, in terms of collaboration with our students, we identified a half dozen or so of issues that most people would kind of align with the Democratic Socialist agenda. In fact, students went to that website, and we pulled a bunch of issues to test. And yes, single-payer health care was essentially the #1 issue that young people could have supported associated with this agenda. And it's something we've seen consistently with the entire electorate in terms of the importance of health care in this election, but also with young people as well. But it's not the only issue where almost 2/3 of young people kind of align with the Democratic Socialist agenda.
Where else is that?
There's a couple of other big ones. The second one is access to education, specifically free college at public universities and colleges for students from families who earn less than $125,000 a year. Over 3 in 5 likely voters support that. And the third one, again, a little bit of a surprise, guaranteed federal work. Specifically, if you don't have a job, the government will provide one for you, including a minimum wage of at least $15 an hour with benefits. Those 3 issues, access to health care, access to education, access to a job, 3 out of 5 likely voters of this election support that. In fact, in some cases, over 30% of Trump voters, Republicans, support those clear Democrat socialist or socialist kind of agendas. They're kind of like a la carte socialists.
Yeah. And then the flip side of this, too, I guess, is if you look at Trump and attitudes towards him on issues, I think we have this graphic, his approval rating on a series of issues here among 18 to 29-year-olds. The president, here it is, the economy, health care, immigration, race relations, gun violence, Kavanaugh. He's in the 20s. The best he does is 35% on the economy. If you're looking at this from a Trump standpoint, if you're looking at this from a Republican standpoint where Trump is your standard bearer, is there any good news in this poll from a Republican standpoint?
It's difficult. It's difficult to see. I'm spinning here a little bit. The best news would be that Trump, obviously President Obama was far more popular with young people than President Trump. 4 years ago today, he had the same rating, I think the exact same rating in terms of handling of the economy. So maybe that's good, but the difference, though, is that President Obama, his job approval on race relations was twice what President Trump's is. And I think his response to gun violence and race is really kind of the anchor that's preventing him from moving higher in the polls, even among young Republicans. That's
interesting. And you do have him, of all of the issues we just ticked through there, race relations is the lowest approval number for Trump among 18 to 29. 23% approve, 76% say they disapprove. That's the widest margin you have there. I wonder, some people have made this observation. I wonder if you think there's anything to it. Think way back to 1972 and George McGovern, right? And George McGovern, it was the sort of the candidate of the anti-war, the protesters, the hippies, whatever you want to say, who were at that point, a lot of them were boomers, right? And this was their first election, and of course it didn't work out well for George McGovern. But that same generation that was sort of the McGovern generation, the boomers, you go all the way to 2016, Donald Trump's doing pretty well with the boomers now. How much changed from a generation sort of reaching the age when they start voting to the age when they start voting in the numbers you see 65 plus? Is the generation just going to become more conservative as it goes along?
History and punditry would indicate that's the case. However, we've been tracking young voters since 2000, and so the oldest millennials are now in their mid-30s, late 30s, and we found them, as you know, to be the most progressive members of the electorate today. It's when we look at, for example, the Alabama special last year, I think the Democrat Jones won 2/3 of the vote under the age of among young people under the age of 45, whereas Roy Moore won 2/3 over age 45. So I think what we're seeing is they're breaking those rules. They're becoming more progressive, not less progressive, as they get older. And as you indicated, the more settled they are, the more likely they are to vote. So I'm not sure kind of that old framework is going to apply to the millennials and potentially the next post-millennial generation.
And can you think of, have we seen this stark of a split before, where there's that stereotype, the young voters are more liberal, the old voters are more conservative, but where it's this dramatic?
I don't think so. People always ask us about, is there a gender gap, and there's very little gender gap when it comes to this generation. So I can think of no cleavage in American politics as more stark than plus and minus 45 years of age. Of course, race is a big factor as well, but this is stark. And what we're seeing, I think, in post the 2016 campaign, we're seeing a new generation developing new issues and a new agenda. You can see that in the democratic socialism that we talked about, but also the correlation between voting and school violence and school shootings, et cetera, is very, very strong. We had another survey that we recently conducted. We had 16 different issues associated with voting, associated with the future of America, 16 issues from immigration to health care to job creation, climate change, et cetera. School shootings was the #1 issue, most highly correlated with whether or not someone's going to vote next week. #2 was health care. #3 was gun violence generally. So again, new generation, new set of issues, and I do think hopefully they'll be taken seriously once the new Congress gets into session.
Well, yeah, so it's the question of what this is going to mean 8 days from now in the midterm, and then obviously 2020, how it's going to shape the agenda then. But this is just a fascinating study, very timely, because this is a question on a lot of people's mind heading into the election. John Della Volpe from Harvard, thank you. Appreciate it. All right, and thank you for joining us at home. And again, the countdown continues. We're here every day between now and the midterms, 8 days away. Tomorrow, we're officially 1 week out. I thought we'd never get there, but look at that. Time flies. Thank you for watching at home. We will see you right back here tomorrow at noon Eastern.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.